This story is told in the perspective of a female. A little bit of context as to what made this story absolutely terrifying. I was 14 and this took place just last year in the fall, and at the time we lived in Boston getting ready to move. Life was kind of like what you'd expect in Boston. It was warm for most parts of the year and it would completely change as the colder months came in. My family and I had been living in an apartment complex ever since I was born, and I basically considered it as my childhood. The complex was located in the suburbs of Boston, which meant that we were far away from the actual city, which I very much enjoyed. Behind the apartments were some woods that went on for about a few miles, and beyond the woods was my old elementary school. I used to go through there when I was younger and pretend that I was exploring to tell people that I was searching for artifacts. Since we were about to move, I thought I'd take at least one last hike through the woods to my old school just to say a quick goodbye kind of thing. Let me point out that even in the month of October, it was still unbelievably cold outside, forcing me to put on extra layers of clothing. I get on my shoes and jacket and start walking into the woods. Most of the leaves had already fallen off of the trees with that iconic brownish orange color that we all know and love. Eventually, I reached the end of the path and had entered what used to be my school's soccer field. This was on a weekend, so the school was obviously closed. I'm walking over to the park area to maybe sit down on the swing when I noticed some guy I had never seen before sitting on one of the benches. At first, I got a bit disappointed as I thought it was a security guard and I would get in trouble for trespassing. But upon closer inspection, this guy didn't even look like one. In fact, he didn't even wear anything that resembled a security guard. This guy was wearing a pair of cargo pants and had a long white sleeve sweater on, and his hair was a mess. The thing I remember most about him was the fact that he had been fidgeting and having a few verbal tics. Since we lived in the suburbs, you'd have your fair share of creeps and weirdos every now and then, so I dismissed it as one of them. I sat on the swing, scrolling through Instagram and whatnot, when I looked to my left and see the guy walking up to me. The thing that caught me off guard was the obvious blank expression he had on his face, like he was doing something mundane, like taking out the trash or raking the leaves. I give him a friendly nod and go back to my phone. He keeps walking and eventually stops right in front of me and says the following. "Hey there. I've lost my dog and I can't find him. Can you please help me look for him?" I was skeptical at first, but being a person who absolutely adored dogs, I couldn't help but say yes. He then looked at me and gave me an unsettling smile while reaching out his hand as if he wanted me to come with him. It was at this point when I decided that there was something off about the situation. Even though there wasn't anything too off about his appearance or personality, something in my gut told me not to go with him. I quickly tell him that I forgot that I had a dentist appointment to go to and apologized. I know, not the best excuse, but I had to think of one fast enough before he caught on. As I'm getting up from the swing, his creepy smile turns into a frown. It was kind of like the look a child gives when they can't have a toy or candy. Coming from someone who looked to be in their late 30s, it was much more disturbing. As soon as I get up, he says 5 words that have haunted me till this day. "Okay, see you later, Courtney." He said my name. I have no idea as to how he knew or if he just guessed it. But needless to say, I walked away from there and eventually made it back to the complex. The next week, we had left Massachusetts and started to begin our new lives in Florida. I'm not sure if he had taken a lucky guess when he was getting my name right, or the possibility that he somehow knew. I'm a 22-year-old female, and this happened about a few weeks ago. For some context, I work at my local Starbucks as a barista and would oftentimes have to work super early in the mornings as I had classes during the afternoon and night. This was during the global pandemic, and our state was one of the states that reported a high record of increasing cases. And seeing as fall was rolling in, it was no big surprise. Because of this, our manager obviously made us clean the shop like crazy and made sure we were on top of it. This included wiping down the tables and making sure everyone wore a mask. One morning, a coworker of mine had told me to go clean the outside tables as a few customers had left. I put on my sweater and mask and start spraying the table when I looked to my right and noticed a guy sitting in his car in the parking lot. Now, this wasn't too strange as the Starbucks was located in the city, so you'd have a lot of people everywhere. I go back inside and continue my place at the counter when the guy from the car walks in. At this point, I realized that he was not a pleasant-looking man. His eyes were red and his skin was pale, and his hair was a mess. He came right up to the counter, and as usual, I greeted him with a, "Hi, welcome to Starbucks. What can I get for you?" He responds with, "I'll just have a medium black coffee, sweetie." I awkwardly smile and tell him his total. He then proceeds to take out a $5 bill and then gives it to me, making sure our hands touch. I tell him that it would be right out, and he goes to sit at a nearby table. While brewing his coffee, I see him constantly staring at me through the corner of my eye, but I tried to make it seem like I wasn't interested and just focused on working. Once the coffee was done, I bring it over to him and tell him to enjoy while walking back to the counter. "So, Kate, what time do you get off?" At first, I was confused as to how he knew my name, but I then realized that I had my name tag on. I quietly cussed to myself and turned around to face him. I answer him nervously and lie, telling him that I got off at 6, when in reality I got off at 4. He asks me if he could pick me up to give me a ride home, and I politely decline, telling him that I already have a ride. He went from just your average Starbucks customer to just plain rude. Thankfully, he takes his coffee and walks right out the door. I begin to tell my coworker about the guy, and she gets this shocked look on her face and recommends I tell the manager. For some reason, at that point, I didn't end up reporting him to our manager, which, looking back, was a stupid decision. Finally, 4 p.m. comes around and I tell my coworker that I'm leaving. I go outside to my car, making sure the guy was nowhere in sight. Thankfully, he wasn't. Being a paranoid person who watches way too many horror movies, I thought for sure that he would be out here waiting for me. The next day when I come into work, my coworker comes over to me and says, "Kate, is everything okay?" in somewhat of a worried voice. I respond with yes and tell her about the guy from yesterday. What she said next chilled me to the bone. That guy came in the store just before 6. He said he was here to pick you up. My heart sank into the pit of my stomach, and I told her that I lied to him, claiming that I got off at 6, which is why he was here. I then told my manager everything that had happened, and he said that he would keep an eye out for him. The most disturbing part, however, is later that day, My coworker had told me that when he got out of his car, she saw two hidden men in the back seat. After that, I quit my job at Starbucks as I didn't feel safe, and I now work at a grocery store. God only knows what would have happened to me had I told him the real time I got off. This took place in Norway during the autumn back in 2010 when I was in my teenage years. This is by far the weirdest and most strangest encounter I've ever come across in my life. I lived with my grandparents at the time, as both my parents were verbally and physically abusive to each other. Because of this, my grandparents had taken me to go live with them as they didn't want me to live in an unsafe environment of a household. My grandparents worked during the day, and even though I was young, they trusted me very well and would oftentimes let me stay home alone until they got back. It made me feel special and mature. One day, my grandma was out doing errands and my grandpa was at work. Normally, my grandma would ask if I wanted to come with her, but my grandma was the kind of shopper who spent long hours shopping for products that had the best deals. I got bored very easily and wanted no part in that, so I always stayed home. I stayed in the living room and was occupying myself by playing a few video games on my Xbox. Then, at around 6 p.m., I start to get hungry and go to the kitchen to go grab a snack. As I'm walking to the kitchen, I hear a loud, frantic knock at the door, which startled me a bit. It was a bit odd considering we lived in a rural area and the nearest town was miles away, so it was rare for someone to be at our door. Either way, I still wasn't allowed to open the door for anyone. But seeing as it was getting cold outside, and the off chance that somebody needed help, it didn't seem like I had a choice. I go over to the door and ask, "Who is it?" There was no answer, and I really didn't expect one. I undid the lock and opened the door, but to my surprise, there was nobody in sight. I assumed that it was probably just some kids playing Dig Dong Ditch and I closed the door again. Not even 10 seconds later, the frantic knocking came back and I ran to the door hoping to catch the pranksters. But yet again, there was nobody there, and this time I didn't even hear anything. The only thing I could hear was the wind howling and the autumn leaves fall to the ground. I go back inside, and as soon as I do, the knocking comes back and I open the door immediately to see nobody. My heart sank into the pit of my stomach as it didn't make any sense. I shut the door and locked it and told myself that I wouldn't open it again no matter what. And that's what I did. I stayed up in my room until one of my grandparents got back, and I was still trying to process as to what the hell I just witnessed. An hour later, my grandma finally came back from shopping, but I never did tell her about the knocking. Even if I did, she still probably wouldn't have believed me. I went to bed that night, thinking all about the incident, because I know what happened. I just can't seem to wrap my head around it.